What I try to do now is begin with a summary of, I think, what we know about why children are not learning as well as they should, as I think both Mr. Pandey and Mr. Hemming said. There is clear concern about the learning levels in India and elsewhere. And then what I want to do is sort of go through a kind of laundry list of sort of kinds of interventions that have been tried and what has been found. I do that with a purpose, so it might sound like a list, but I do that with a purpose, which is to then draw out a few common strands that lie under them so that I can tell you a kind of a story of what is going on or what we think is going on there. From that, then it's easier to transition into a discussion of policy. So, bear with me for a little bit. It's going to sound like, lots of things, but eventually there is a method in that apparent madness. Okay, so this is a background that was already mentioned. It's not an India problem only. It's a problem that we've now found. We've seen data from Pakistan, in Kenya, and in Ghana as well. So the data is very, very, what's striking is very similar patterns, which is children in 5th grade who read at 2nd grade level or below. That's sort of a pattern we see in many of these countries. And actually, not just Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. We see this in a bunch of countries, and I suspect if we were to look in other countries, we'll find a lot of the same patterns. I'm now pretty convinced that the same pattern exists, and for the same reason. I'll come to the reasons later. What is not in this data, but is very nice data that Karthik Muralidharan will speak later, but not speak about that so much, will mention, is that not only do kids in 5th grade not read at grade level, they don't even read at 2nd grade level. Most of those kids who are going to read at, let's say, 2nd grade level will do so by their time they're in 2nd grade. Then they'll stop. So, the readings of the kids who are going to be, so we now look at sort of a kind of a cross-section. We look at the 5th graders and say, they don't read at grade level, they read at 2nd grade level. If you track those kids, you find that the kids who were going to reach 5th grade without reading at 3rd grade level were at 2nd grade level, stuck at 2nd grade level forever. When they were 2nd grade, they were at 2nd grade level or below, and they were stuck there. Or in reverse, the kids who get to grade level in 5th grade were at grade level in 2nd and 3rd and 4th grades. So in other words, some kids just drop off, and that's 60% of the kids basically drop off and stay off. Very little progress happens once they drop off. That's a sort of fact to keep in mind because it makes the problem much more striking. It's not just that kids are behind, they're just catching up slowly. They dropped off the bus and they never got back on. That's the image to keep in mind. And that sort of makes the problem quite different and perhaps more worrying. Now, this is sort of, you could add more things, but this is sort of, if you ask somebody what's going on, they'll tell you some of these answers will come up depending on who you're talking to. And I'll go through these. So one standard answer is lack of inputs. Now inputs mostly, I'll give you the kind of exceptions. Inputs mostly have very little effect. That's sort of a very striking pattern that keeps coming back. And so some of them are like textbooks, for example. This was a school where almost no kids had textbooks. The intervention was just giving them textbooks. Almost none, on average, kids got nothing out of getting the textbooks. Only the best kids, the kids in the top quarter, gained something from getting the textbook. The rest had zero effect. So you would imagine that's obvious. They don't have textbooks, how could they study? But that same obvious thing doesn't seem to happen, and we see that time and again. So this is one one exception to that pattern, and I'll say, I want to emphasize this exception because I want to come back to it, which is that this was one case where they gave books, but not textbooks. They gave storybooks, kind of very different from textbooks. So textbooks are, first, they are so not necessarily very exciting. Secondly, they tend to be written with a particular view of what kids should already know in mind. The storybooks were meant to be kind of fun and accessible. So this was storybooks, and this had very quickly had a substantial effect on the reading score. So this is an exception. I want to point out this exception because I want to come back to it reflects a general theme here. Now, one other fact to emphasize is that the one thing that does completely matter is having a school. So if you don't have a school, you don't learn. And you have very big effects in having a school. If you don't, it's not true that kids just pick up knowledge by themselves. It's you know, having a school matters, but what in the school doesn't seem to matter very much. What's most striking, I would say, is this one. And this is sort of like, goes against every sort of received wisdom in the subject, but we have done this now many times. The first time we did it was the mid-90s, then we did it again in this was in Rajasthan, then we did it in Mumbai and Vadodara, then now there's been a new study in Kenya. Each of these cases, the class size was cut in half, had zero effect on test scores. That's sort of a very striking fact because that's kind of the first order reaction people have is hire more teachers, or we need more help in classrooms. That might be true. I'm not saying you don't need more help, but if you just business as usual, take the teachers, half the classes, you get nothing for it. And that's sort of very, very striking. And we've done this many times. We've done it with the government, we've done it with an NGO. Kenya has done with a very large scale with the Kenyan government. So these were different. So the state governments, city governments, NGOs, we get the same pattern, which is business as usual teaching does nothing for test scores. That's sort of very striking fact to keep in mind. Now, so that's the bad news. The good news is that, and this is a pattern that, I'll say a lot about programs by Pratham, not because Rukmini is here, but because we've actually been evaluating a lot of these programs for many, many years now, and we always find very large effects of these interventions. These are basically all the interventions based on the same philosophy, which is children who are falling behind or have fallen behind need some hand-holding and some teaching at the level they are. So the teaching at where the kids are, that basic idea that if you can't read, then teaching you history is not very useful. Let's teach you how to read instead. So that it's not exactly rocket science, but it works dramatically. What's striking is especially that a lot of the instances where it has worked, it has not required a lot of resources. These are not highly trained teachers who were sent to Harvard to get training in teaching. These were mostly teachers who were, in this particular intervention, they were actually paid. How much were they paid? They were 1,000 rupees a month. This is a long time ago, 10 years ago, but still, 1,000 rupees a month. These women had 10 years of education usually, 10 to 12 years of education. You put them in a classroom and you see that you get 0.6 standard deviations. Now what's this word standard deviations will come up. Let me just, that's a way education attainment is measured. What does it mean? So it's very simple actually. It looks like mumbo jumbo, but it's very simple. 2 standard deviations is basically the difference between the best performing child in a class and the worst performing child. So this says that we covered 30% of the gap between the best and the worst child. So the best child will basically know everything, and the worst child probably is completely lost, and that 30% of that gap was covered. For every child, on average, 30% of the gap was covered. So so keep in mind, whenever you see a standard deviation, all you think of is the total gap is 2 standard deviations, and this is, so 0.6 standard deviations is 30% of that gap. For every child, on average, that was covered. This is another Pratham program. This was evaluated in in Jaunpur district in East UP. And this was done by volunteers. Again, you see very large gains in test scores. This was another program. This was done in Bihar. Here, by this time, we had sort of become more, I think, more ambitious in our evaluation. So what we did was we actually created multiple variants of the intervention. So some of the variants of the intervention were basically school-based. So the intervention gave the resources. So the training was given to the teachers. So the teachers were trained to do this pedagogical intervention, and they were given the materials. I should say one thing: not only are these people who do this remedial teaching paid very little or nothing, as the case may be. In the previous study, the Jaunpur study, they were paid nothing. The training is never more than a week. So so everything is minimally resourced. So we are not talking about large, expensive interventions. These are the cheapest interventions you could do on the teaching front. If you think of, hiring a new teacher costs, nearly 2 lakh rupees a year now. So these were tiny interventions, plus all the training that's gone into these people. These were tiny interventions by that scale, and they all had very large effects. So the thing that was striking in this particular one, this was done in Bihar and Uttarakhand, there were multiple variants where only the materials were given to the schools, variants where the teachers were trained to use the materials, and variants where a volunteer was provided in addition to the teachers and the materials to help the kids catch up. The only variant that worked was where there's out-of-school volunteers helping the children. That's the only variant that worked. There was basically 4 different variants here. And without the volunteers, and when the volunteers were out of school, that's the only version that worked. This is the opposite fact, in a sense. It says that when these school teachers, during the summer, when they were not teaching the regular curriculum, were given some, again, minimal training to, again, help the children where they are, you get very large gains. Indeed, the gains here are, if you measure the kids who actually went to these summer camps, is 1 standard deviation. So 50% of the gap between the worst and the best performing child was covered by this. So these are enormous gains. So you see this, both the fact that we didn't manage to embed it in the school system when it was during the school year, and the fact that when you actually, so this number, 0.24 standard deviations, is I said 1 standard deviation. That's actually correct, but maybe explaining exactly why this is sort of conditioning on something else. So I'll come back to that. So here's another one. This was the first program that I saw of this whole class, which actually worked in the school system. So this is in Maharashtra. This is a program that was for literacy skill development only, and it was implemented both as a standalone intervention and as more a supplementary intervention, and it clearly works better as a supplementary intervention. So but it was, again, this is the first one that worked. What's different about this one? Well, it was very targeted to a particular outcome. So this was within the school system, but time was assigned to this program so that within the school day, there would be time that was given to using these specific materials for helping children to learn to read. So this was the difference between the Bihar program, where the materials were given, the training was given, but the structure was not changed. And that's sort of very important, that these 2 interventions are similar, but there's one difference, which is that the space was created here. Here there was a clear guideline that you had to have a certain amount of time set aside for it. And time, I'll argue that time is crucial in making a difference. So just to summarize, these kinds of interventions, remedial education, in principle can have very large effects, even when used by school teachers. It's not the case that teachers are incapable of teaching. That should not be true and is not true. But you need to have this kind of very quite specific focus on creating the space for learning which is not constrained by the regular flow of the day. This is something that Aprajit will talk about, so I will not talk about it. Mixed results, but perhaps my sense of these results are that this is also suggesting that when you actually embed this into the learning process in the right way, then again there's potential for large gains. I'll skip this. This is complicated to explain. Let me just come to the next set of interventions. So the next set of interventions have something to do with demand. So one other story you could tell is that basically these kids don't learn because they don't really, the parents have sent them to school, but the kids don't want to learn, or the parents don't have the time to invest in the children's learning. Some evidence of, prima facie evidence of that is there. I mean, you look at children we talk a lot about teachers not showing up. Children don't show up. In Bihar, a number that's striking is after lunch, 30% of the children are in school. That's a very, very, very low number. And that's more generally the pattern you see, that, that we have these volunteer classes. These are very beneficial, but only 8% of the children showed up for it. So that's sort of the general pattern. There doesn't seem to be a great deal of demand. Now, one reason to not take that on face value is that demand has something to do with what's being delivered and children's perception of what's being delivered. So children are, so if you are, think of the child who's in fourth grade, he's learning history. Somebody said there are 13 subjects in Haryana, is that right? Ghana. 13 subjects in second grade. Okay. So you're learning history in fourth grade, and you can't read. What are you getting out of that class? It must be torture, in fact. It's like watching a movie in a language you've never heard without subtitles. So it must be. I actually imagine sitting through a class where I understand nothing for day after day after day. Kids don't show up. Of course, they're sensible. So I don't want to treat this as prima facie evidence, but there's some nice evidence of demand effects which suggests that there is something to the idea that if you can actually got kids excited about the outcome of learning, you might actually get changes. So this is a very interesting study. This was quite expensive. It offered $20 scholarship for girls in the top 15% of test scores. So basically, this is in Kenya, quite a lot of money if you get in the top 15%. This had girls did better as a result of this. That's not so surprising, except that even girls who were at the bottom of the class did better. And more strikingly, boys did better. Why did boys do better when girls get scholarship? Well, the boys went and basically, the whole class became more energized because the girls demanded more education, the teachers showed up more, the teachers held more classes, so therefore everybody benefited. So partly these incentives had. What's a nice study in India is by Jim Berry. This was, again, working with Pratham. This was quite the opposite. These were tiny prizes. This was like a little plastic ball, that kind of prizes, but they were for performance, I think, every 2 months. So every 2 months, if the kid did well, he would get something. So much more immediate rewards, not at the end of the year. And this had test score effects across the distribution. So all kids did better as a result of this intervention. And this was just tiny prizes for first graders. Even first graders who were getting tiny prizes were responding to them. So the fact that somehow the goalpost was brought much closer to them seemed to matter. there was something that you could do. It's not, education was not just about, passing the class 12 exam. It was something about, some proximate goal seemed to matter. But most strikingly, just telling parents. So this is a very nice set of studies. Rob Jensen did a study where he basically went around telling random set of parents that there are jobs in call centers for your daughters. This is in Haryana. As a result, you see large increases in school attendance, school performance, height of girls. Everything seems to change as a result. Parents just got much more excited about the girls' sort of human capital. Even simpler interventions. So these are interventions where parents were told that even if you are from your background, you get the returns to education pretty high. So basically they went and told that, look, people from your background who have class 10 education have this income, those who have class 5 education have this income. So this was just literally just describing the data, adjusting for the background. That had very large effects. In Madagascar, that was 0.4 standard deviation, just by telling people that these are test scores. This is the gains. So this is like, you just tell people and they seem to respond. So clearly demand is an issue. Now, interesting question is demand everything? So one way to look at that is to look at private schools. Private schools, after all, are the ultimate of sort of, you're spending money. So, demand is expressed through expensive act of choice. Mostly the private school results in India have been very disappointing. So there's a nice study of a voucher study where some people were given vouchers through a lottery in Andhra Pradesh to go to private schools. You look at the effect of that, you see essentially no gains. So when people won vouchers by lottery, overall they don't do any better than the ones who didn't get the vouchers. And if you look at more generally, if you look at the ASA data, and Rukmini has a study where they try to control for various, within family differences as much as they can. But having done all that, they don't find massive effects of these things. So this is not a randomized controlled trial, but to the extent that you can see the effects seem to be small, if any. These effects are probably bigger than they should be, because what they're doing is they're comparing children in the same family who are going to private school and going to public school. But as I'll say in a minute, families discriminate actively between children. So these kids, probably the ones who go to private school, are also getting many other benefits. So if you look at the net effect of private school, this is the upper bound of that. The point is to compare this with some of the interventions that we talked about, which had much bigger effects. And the interesting question is, why aren't private schools adopting this intervention? So if you can get 0.6 standard deviations by doing what Pratham was doing by paying somebody 1,000 rupees a month, why isn't the private school, which has all the incentives in the world, adopting those innovations? So that's the interesting question. In some sense, it gives us a clue to what's going on. So this is what I just said. So let me try to now come back and say, I promise that I'll try to provide an interpretation of these results. My basic interpretation is that the problem is shared by private schools, NGO schools, government schools, which is that the curriculum dictates what gets life much too much. So in some sense, the fundamental problem is that the pedagogy is based on covering material rather than teaching children what they need to learn. So if you have not learned reading in first grade, you have to learn history now. It doesn't matter whether you can read or not. So the entire system is based on the premise that the goal is to cover material. Now, why is that the system's goal? People are not irrational. Why doesn't parents come and complain? Well, one reason is that parents and everyone else within the system have bought into the idea that the goal of schooling is to get you through to the class 12 exam, and then you get a job. fact, most of these people will never get there. So in other words, they think of the schooling as being a very long odds lottery. You get in, if you happen to be smart, then you get to the class 12 exam, you get a job, and otherwise it's worthless. All the evidence suggests the opposite, which is that there is gains to education throughout the distribution. So even if you just get from class 6 to 7, you get some gains. It's not that you just only gains are at the top. So in some sense, everybody's bought. The whole system is based on the premise that the real gains from education come from getting through this final hurdle. Now, if you buy that for a second, then a number of things follow. One is that parents are very keen to find the smart child who can get there. You see that all the time. I always give the example. You go to families and they'll just say that he's really not really bright, buddhu, and so therefore we send him to government school. And she's really bright, and we send her to the private school. And it's often the girl who's bright. It's not. I mean, you hear that even in Rajasthan, where there's otherwise lots of discrimination. You hear that they're really looking for, and this is in Pakistan, there's a very nice study which asks parents in Pakistan, in Punjab, in Pakistan, why do you send one child to private school and one child to government school? And they say that she's smart and he's smart. And the gender effects are pretty small, actually, even in Pakistan. The big effects are parents' theories about children. So what's happening is children entering school, parents are deciding, by the end of first 6 months, some children start picking up stuff, others don't. This has nothing to do with innate ability, mostly has to do with attitude, maturity, all kinds of things which have nothing to do with eventual potential. But parents immediately impose the theory that these children are never going to make it and these children will. And given the way school system operates, that's actually true, because the school system also believes that. So they also start ignoring the children who are falling behind. So everybody sort of takes that one, starts discriminating against the children. If you look at we did a classroom observation study in 1997 in Udaipur. And basically, we wanted to see all kinds of measures of classroom observation, or how many children are being asked questions, etc. In the end, the most striking fact was that, of course, no one was asked any questions pretty much, but the teacher looked at 2 to 3 children during the whole day. Just eye contact with 2 to 3 children in the classroom. So basically, the whole theory is based on the idea that there are winners and losers, and you know that from the beginning. These are essentially built into the kids, so it's pretty hopeless. So this would explain a lot of things. One is, why does being in school matter? Well, having a school matters because, after all, some children learn. So those children wouldn't get a chance to learn. But the teacher-student ratio doesn't matter. Why? Because the teacher doesn't matter. The teacher's looking at the top of 2 or 3 children. Rest of the class is being ignored in any case, so it doesn't matter if there are 40 people you're ignoring or 20. It's essentially you're ignoring all of them. It doesn't make a big difference. So that's why it doesn't matter. Why do textbooks work for the best children? They're written for the best children. The whole curriculum is designed for the best children, and the rest of the children really are not in the calculus very much. So in that sense, why is remedial education or teaching where children are so effective? Well, not surprising. The children are just, it's not the children are actually unable to learn. They're just not being given a choice. Why do government teachers do so differently in these two contexts? Well, because they are being given, in the summer school, they're told your job is to teach these children how to read. They are good teachers, they just have not, when in class, we actually asked them in Bihar, do you use the Pratham materials? And they first say yes, but then you push them a little bit and it turns out they don't use it a lot. Why don't they use it? They say that we don't have time. We have to cover the curriculum. In fact, the right to education says that it's a law that we cover the curriculum. So it's, in a sense, it's a structure. The whole structure is the curriculum based, whereas in some sense the goal should be that children actually learn. So if you take this, you believe what I'm saying, then a set of, I think, there's some obvious answers and a lot of interesting questions. So I think some of the basic questions are ideas come out of this are simple, which is, you should emphasis on basic skills as against content. If you take a country like Finland, which is like does extremely well on international tests. Basically, Finland doesn't have almost any content at early grades. The whole education system is based on, we don't have to teach any content till children are, 9 or 10. Just focus on get their basic skills right. So that's sort of one extreme view, but certainly that's an interesting model. So obviously, in order to be able to teach at the right level, at the child's level, you need to know where the children are. I think that one of the idea, that's an idea that's in the new education policies, the CCE, the continuous evaluation processes are meant to do exactly that, and to the extent that they can be developed to work, that will start happening, so you will know where children are. But then the entire teaching structure has to be given the freedom to then act on that information. It's not just a matter of knowing that this kid is falling behind. You also need to be able to address that within the structure. If you have to take the curriculum forward, and you can't wait, then obviously that's not. Breaking up the class structure, the grade structure might be important. For example, I think that it's not clear that age cohorts should just track themselves. With the, now that we have both, people start school more or less at the same age, and then there is no grade repetition, you get automatically people who, despite the fact that they have not learned what their peers have learned, they get promoted, and now they have to study history or science or whatever. So there's no reason not to destigmatize class repeating. Indeed, why not break up the age structure much more? I think it's clear that it would be better if kids were not necessarily forced to follow their age cohort in every subject at the same time.
So you realize that in my presentation, you will see some similarities, and it's all part of the infection. If you look at the whole program in Ghana, we had some few questions which really motivated us to go into the program. Overarching question is the fact that a lot of money is being spent in education, but not much learning is taking place. Ghana spends over 30% of its national budget on education. So if children are not learning, then it gives us the question to find answers to why children are not learning. And so, looking at some of the interventions, there are evidences which suggest that assistance teaching targeted lessons to lowest achievers can improve early grade reading. And as it has been said over here, in most cases, you'll find that about a third or 2/3 of the pupils will not be learning. But generally, the indicators are only pointing at general performance of our children. But you go to the classroom, and then you realize that about a third or half, about 2/3, are not really meeting the standards. So the question, can this effect be replicated under the school conditions in Ghana? And are targeted lessons most effective when complementary or supplementary to normal class? Looking at all these other areas, and its effect caused by the smaller class sizes, like Prof said, there have been attempts to reduce the number of pupils, because people are talking about the PTR is so large that teachers are not able to control it. So if you reduce this number, will the teachers be able to manage? Could we achieve the same effect from providing in-service teacher training on targeting lessons? The teachers are there. So you realize that when they come to the design, you will see how some of these changes are being effected. So what is the Teacher Community Assistant Initiative? Now, this program is trying to combine all successful interventions reading from Kenya, from India, ASA tests, and all that, at least putting together to help us to design the program. And we learned a lot from ASA, from their simple assessment of pupils. You don't need a very rigorous test to determine those children who are not doing very well. And children taught by ability levels. It has been said here by Prof that we are all being directed by the curriculum, that we have 5 years of, we have 6 years of primary, 3 years of junior high, and then 2 years of kindergarten. So you start at age 6 from class 1. When you go to stage 2, that's the class, you have to move to class 2. It's not about the learning, but it is about the age. And we are talking about over 8 students, over 8 pupils in our classrooms. So as part of the strategies, you might have to make sure that you don't repeat children, because the thing that is also another cost area. You repeat a child for 1 year, it costs so much. Focus time on literacy and numeracy, child-centered pedagogy, learning, and the use of community assistance. So all these are the different components that we are trying to evaluate and look at how it will help our educational system. There is also another program that we call as the National Youth Employment Program. In fact, the government intention was to provide jobs for the youth who were just moving around. They don't have anything to do. So at least by giving them something. So we have, they started with about 6 components. And teaching was one of the components that was providing job for the National Youth Employment Program. So the government established this program and was paying them a little. And we call them, those are the people that we are using as our teaching assistants. And then we also have a very strong teacher union in Ghana. And we need to work in collaboration with this teacher union so that when it comes to the politics of the teacher, at least we are protected in that respect. And the school community, the community is also very important. This time around, we are talking about ownership by the community. So if you don't really bring them into the picture, then there's no way that you can succeed. So all these are key components and stakeholders for the education in Ghana. And we make sure that we use these components. We also have partners like School for Life, who are using 9 months training for our children, especially those who are not doing well, using the local language so that they will transit from the local language to the English language. And it has been practiced in the northern Ghana. It has proved to be very, very successful. So they are also our partners in this particular program. And sustainability is also very, very critical that we need to look at, because if we are not able to sustain it, and you know finances is key. And once the NYEP is already existing, the government is paying them, then it is a guarantee that we can sustain our program using these community assistance. And in effect, it's a very relatively low-cost program, because the amount of money that these NYEPs are being paid is just about a fifth of a trained teacher at that particular level. So you can imagine that it's a low-cost program that can be sustained. Then how is the program designed? If you look at experience from Pratam, you see we've added some other things. Because I remember very well when we were discussing about the areas that you have to evaluate. There was strong conviction that why don't we think about even providing some in-service training for the existing teachers? So we added that as one of our interventions. So the first intervention is teach the remedial curriculum during school hours. So during school hours, there's an arrangement where these teaching assistants will take those who are lagging behind and then providing them with some sort of programs. And then after school session, so after school, people will remain there, and then these assistants will take them through. And then the third one was the random split class. At least when you get to that particular teaching, then you split them based on that, and then the teaching assistants will be taking part, and then the class teachers will also be doing that. and then the wholly providing teachers with some sort of in-service training to improve, and then the usual control group. Now, the preliminary results indicate that in school and after-school remedial program caused the largest increases in student test scores in school and then after school. And we could see that the test scores were primarily driven by improvements in basic literacy and numeracy skills. That was our focus, basic literacy and numeracy skills. And then after-school remedial program was slightly more effective than the during school, particularly in deprived districts. After school, initially you were thinking that even after school, these children will not come, because when you go to the deprived areas, it appears some of them are even coming from very far away, and they may be hungry. Not all the schools are having a school feeding program. So that was even an assumption that it may not work very well after school. But we realized that even this particular program worked very well in the deprived communities. And in school, we are thinking that maybe lack of infrastructure in deprived schools may have prevented assistants from finding necessary space. Because when you go to the rural areas, the classrooms are not even there. So if you want to do it in school, it will mean that the pupils will have to be sent maybe under trees or somewhere corner there. Getting a place was a difficult thing. So maybe this might have caused that. And then after school program allow for more focused learning time. After school, you know that, yes, they are there, then you take them through. Because in school, there are other activities that may be going on, which may even be distracting their attention. But after school, they have time for whatever. And then simply training teachers to target their lessons or reducing the class size by adding an assistant had minimal impact on the test scores. Trying the teachers themselves with the assistants, suggesting that the impact of remedial program was driven by the combination of intensive basic skills instruction with low-performing pupils. Very, very, very critical in as far as the preliminary results are concerned. What was tested? These are the areas, oral English and then local languages. Previously, if you look at the previous test that the National Educational Assessment, they were not even testing the oral English. But with this, we introduce the orals, because if you are talking about reading, oral is very, very critical. So we look at listening, reciting, conversation, the grammar, vocabulary, and then the reading, and then the pre-reading. All these areas were tested, and all tests included sessions on most basic skills, which were the focus for the remedial pedagogy. That's level 1, reading and sound recognition of alphabets, reading 2 and 3 letter words, and then reading more complex sounds and longer words. So these were the areas that were tested, which we learned a lot from India. Now, this shows the reading and pre-reading. That if you look at English reading, you could see that was the baseline, and that's for the control. And during school hours, it appears there was not impact. But after school hours, we had about 2.6 percentage points, which was very, very encouraging. And for the revision group and the teacher training, there wasn't any significant impact there. And then we're using both local and then the English language, because now by our regulation, we have to use both. So we have introduced the National Accelerated Literacy Program, which combines the English language and the local language. And there too, at least during school hours, we had about 1.6 percentage points, and then after school. So you could still see that in school and then after school, we had some significant impact, but for the revision group and the teacher training, the impact was not significant. Then for basic skills, literacy 1, that's level 1. There too, you'll see the during school hours impact, but it's still higher after school. Right now, we have some impact with the teacher training. And the assumption may be that since the teacher training, you are taking care of all the children. It appears that those who are already good, who are above the minimal standard, might have really affected the test score for the teacher training component. Then the basic skills too, we have at least some improvement. The same thing will go for the teacher training. But I still find that after school hours, the impact was very, very great. So if you put the results together, summary, you will see that intensive remedial classes deliver improved learning outcomes. That is coming out very, very clear. That improvement are highest in basic skills. So if it's about basic skills, that is great. But if it's above the minimum, maybe you will need some other strategy. Then it's also the highest impact in after-school program than during school program. So that if we can really look at the after-school program, it has more impact than in-school program. And then teacher training also had some positive impact, but we can see that only on basic literacy in upper half of the class because of the situation in the classroom. And results are comparable to other successful educational interventions after 1 year, which is very, very true. Then 2, improved learning outcomes achieved despite short time of teaching before survey and other implementation challenges. Results stronger for during school teacher community assistant intervention where school conditions were good. Where school conditions were good, then that was very possible. But larger potential exists that can be achieved by optimizing the program, increasing quality of teaching of assistants to the standard of better performing ones, increasing time on task, and then improving monitoring, then increase assignment rate to the remedial class from current rate of 34 to 50%. Like I said from the beginning, we were thinking that maybe in school will be better, or the impact will be higher with in school. But here we are, after school is coming out stronger than in school. So sometimes you may be thinking that, oh, this is good. Why don't you do this? It's very, very important for us to have evidence before we can take decision. Like Prof says, there have been a number of interventions, and if our political parties are making a campaigning, or what they are talking about, yes, I'll build more schools. I'm going to end schools under trees. Textbooks, 1:1. Teacher training. Right now, we are moving away from people teaching at a basic level, that the minimum qualification should be diploma. Whether that will address the problem or not, we just want quality teachers. But the question we are asking is, how do we define quality? In terms of qualification of the teacher, or in terms of what? So these are all questions that you need evidence to really prove that this one will work. The context is also very important. If you look at part-time intervention and our intervention, you realize that there is some differences. Like when we came here, you could see we visited some of the sites where the parents were even there sitting on the floor with them and say, can we adopt this, the Ghanaian situation? Because in Ghana, we don't sit on the floor to learn because they will think that it's something. But it's very good practice in India where you can easily share some of these things. So the context is very, very important. In Ghana, we have deprived schools. We need to look at what is good for them. And then we also have the in-school. Some schools are very good. What will be good for them? So the context is very, very important. But we need evidence to prove that this has worked or this will work. And then simple assessment systems. You realize that in some cases you'll be thinking of how do you get the feedback of the children? And the test, it takes months to determine who the children are. But using these simple tests, it didn't take us too long a time to get the children who were not doing very well. And then targeting learning levels is very important. Prof has said we are all being driven by the curriculum. The curriculum is that you use 1 hour for this, 30 minutes for that, and this is the content. So all what the teachers are doing, if you come to Ghana, if you ask the teachers, the challenges that they are facing, the first complaint is that the syllabus is too bulky, the syllabus is too, what word do they use? Loaded. So that's all what people are talking, because they are teaching content. Their interest is not about whether the children are learning or not. Because when the supervisor comes to the school, the first question is, were you able to complete the syllabus for term 1? Then you are ticked. Good. But whether the children learned or not is not the matter. It's about completing the syllabus, which is very, very thing that we need to. So focus time on basic skills. Because if you don't really get the initial foundation, it's very difficult for you to move up. And that is why some children are dropping out, because they could not meet the basic skills. And so it's difficult for them to continue. So basic skill is very important. Like it was said, we used to have about 13 subjects for the lower primary. Incredible. And what are they learning? And now that even we have brought it down to about 5, you will see even some integration. Because what you were not doing, we have now added it to something and then called it something. But we still have the same content within that. So though the 13 has been brought to about 6, you still feel the integration of all these subjects. Like, we used to be doing geography, history. Now it says social studies, a combination of geography and history. So if you say that now you have reduced the subjects by 2 or whatever, is it not about the same thing? So you go down there, natural science, integrated science, and a whole lot of things. It's still about the big number that need to be. So if you can really focus on the basic skills. I was in Japan recently, and if you look at their syllabus for the lower primary, mathematics, for instance, they have only 4 themes. 4 themes. Ghana, we have about 15 topics. See, we are dealing with topics, and they are dealing with teams. And if you are dealing with teams, at least you will give some freedom for the teacher to manipulate, maneuver. But if you are giving the topics, then you are forced to finish that topic before you move on to the next one, which sometimes is not very, very helpful. So if you can focus on the basic skills, that would be great, and especially for the low-level learners. And then a moderately trained community member with support, at least, is also very helpful. Now, I remember I went to a school when I asked one of the teaching assistants and whether if he was happy supporting or doing what he was doing. And he told me, these are my younger brothers and sisters, and I think they have to be helped. So you see, you could see that passion from this particular teacher because he's from that community. And if the children are not doing well, he's really feeling for them. So bringing in these community people is very, very important and very, very critical. It doesn't matter whether if he has the diploma or the degree or whatever. But the important thing is, what is the passion? So for the basic skills, you may not need all that big qualification that we are talking about. So it is very, very important for us to look at the community. So the way forward. Lessons from the program, at least we've learned a lot, and which we are thinking we need to incorporate this into the Ghana education system. And there are so many ways that we can do that. We have even learned a lot from the presentation from Prof. And I was telling Mami that we need to see how we can incorporate some of these suggestions. We're thinking of reorienting the existing community education teaching assistance program to focus on providing remedial lessons for lowest achievers. Now, if you go to some of the schools, these NYEP people, they are being employed as classroom teachers. And they are there. And not much impact is being made. But if you can rearrange all this, at least for them to take care of the lower level, I think we can make bigger impact than just putting them into the classroom where some of them have become class teachers and they really don't know how to manage the whole system. And they are also following the curriculum. engaging with community to find alternatives to recruiting and deploying assistants. In fact, we have a lot of them in the system, but the point is, how do we even deploy them? How do we recruit them? And luckily enough, this time around, we have the GPEF, that's the Global Partnership for Education Fund, which Ghana qualified, and at least we are going to enjoy over $75.5 million for the next 3 years. Very encouraging. And as part of the program, we are putting money into the schools and then the districts so that they themselves can initiate some of these programs that we are talking about. And that is where this evidence-based program will be very good for such districts and schools. So if it's about even recruiting these assistants from their community, they will have the money at least to do that, which is very, very, it's a good news for us. And then consider how to deploy resources in deprived and non-deprived districts to have the greatest impact. What is happening in the country now is resources are distributed. You say, yes, textbooks, everybody should get 1-to-1. But you realize that maybe in a particular deprived district, they may need something different. But everything is universal because centralized. So we push all resources there. All teachers should have diplomas. All schools should have that. All schools should have that, which may not be very, very helpful. And then several next steps are planned to encourage scale-up. We are thinking of scale-up. I've learned a lot from yesterday, the dinner we had, how we can scale up, and then also learning from this. I think after this program, we'll be able to see how we can scale up. But we are thinking of improving program functioning, considering long-term institutionalization, so that if the NYEP is going to remain, then we can look at it, how we can institutionalize that, so that this program becomes part and parcel of the system. But learning from here, instead of maybe the classroom or whatever, can we also be thinking about the holiday camping, where we can still use the classroom teachers, but this time around, they will have the freedom to maneuver. The emphasis will be on focused learning. Maybe we can also look at that. And then testing new questions related to early grade reading. This time around, in particular, USAID is going to support us in early grade reading in Ghana. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really take advantage of it and then be asking more questions as to how we can really improve early grade reading. And then the second year evaluation may be to generate better estimates of impact. We've just finished with the first, we are moving to the second evaluation. And then cost effectiveness analysis, enabling comparison with other effective programs to determine which programs have the greatest value for money. Because now we need to be looking at value for money. Very, very critical. It's not just about spending money, but spending money for what? And once the people's learning have become key in our current dispensation, then it is very critical that we look for cost-effective programs that will really earn us a greater value, so that at the end of the day, our children will be learning and they will be able to go up everywhere. They will have the basic skills rather than a child completing basic education and not being able to read and write. And if you cannot read, you cannot do mathematics, you cannot do science. Reading is basic for all. And I'm happy that our politicians are getting to understand us. So dialoguing like this, we learn a lot, so that when you go back, we can also influence and also infect other people so that they will understand the need for us to focus on learning in the school instead of on other things. Thank you very much for your attention.
Some lessons that we've learned over the past 4 decades, but more importantly, over the past 10 or 15 years, sort of during the whole EFA movement, and to build on a lot of the work that USAID has been doing with our partners, particularly on improving quality. So we took seriously this charge to have greater focus, to look at scope and scale, and basically for us to sort of get to the bottom line, we decided that for the first time ever in the history of USAID, in the history of our education sector, we decided to have a very focused education strategy. For those of you who've worked with USAID in the past in other countries, you'll recognize our projects, like many other development partners, had very broad objectives: improve the quality of education for all, sort of along the lines of EFA. And that was great because it gave us a lot of flexibility to respond to the needs and interests of the host countries that we were working, partner countries that we were working with. So in one country we could do infrastructure development, in another country teacher training, somewhere else we could do EMIS, et cetera. And the problem that we had, and I think this is a point that Colin was mentioned earlier, is it was hard for us to sort of add up and aggregate what all that meant. And we were particularly, we had a particular hard time describing what we did and what we accomplished in the education sector to our funders in Congress, who would say, well, why should we give you another $1 billion this year? What have you done with the $1 billion last year, last 10 years, et cetera? So we actually, the focused approach for us was something new. It was frankly quite controversial within the development community, within USAID, within our education sector. But we thought it was the right time. We thought that we had a pretty clear directive from our president, from the USAID administrator. And so one of the key goals in our new education strategy is to improve reading for 100 million children by 2015. This might not sound like a big deal, and I don't see a lot of excited faces out there, but for us, it was actually a huge deal. It was the first time ever we had a numerical target and a time-bound target that we were committing to. And what that meant for us, so now I'm kind of going from the strategic to the program level, what that meant for us was that we had to really think differently about how we did our education programs all around the world. And it forced us to really think about, making sure that the programs that we developed had the appropriate evidence base that was now required. So our new programs have a much more rigorous focus on monitoring and evaluation, on using evidence to inform program design. In terms of scale and piloting, and that's been a big topic of discussion today and is in our sector, I think it's important to make a distinction between, the sort of traditional notions of pilot projects that we're all familiar with. A pilot project starts, it gets funding from external resources, it does really interesting things. The funding dries up, the pilot project never goes to scale. I think we're having a fresh look at that now, and when we talk about scalability, we're talking about trying to build in scalability at the front end of our program, so that we're not talking about doing some interesting stuff in 50 schools, but if there's a sufficient evidence base that we're building on, and we think there are interventions worth pursuing, we want to look at the scalability issues at the front end of our programs, so that we're working on what interventions actually can be adopted, utilized, and have an effect that's large enough that can be sustained through the institutions and the countries that we're working in that have the responsibility of taking the program forward. And that's also a very different ballgame, because we're moving away from a traditional project approach to really working with and through local institutions, developing capacities, and interestingly focusing more not so much on technical issues around teacher training and monitoring and curriculum, but on institutional issues, financing issues, issues around management, issues around decentralization. And that's been and will continue to be challenging for us. So that, I don't want to spend too much time on the strategy, but that's kind of the context for the remarks that Bill made earlier about USAID's interest here in India to look at innovative, evidence-based programming that has the potential to be scaled up and sustained by and through Indian institutions. So that's the USAID strategy. Second thing I wanted to just comment on is I think it's an exciting time for all of us to be working on early grade reading in the sector. I mean, I think for some people, for some organizations like Pratham, I think, who have done pioneering work, you're probably saying it's about time. But to be honest, I think there's now a growing, evolving movement of governments around the world, development partners, local organizations are all sort of coalescing around this idea of, focusing on early grade reading, developing solid foundational skills, having robust metrics, using good, low-cost, low-stakes assessment tools like the early grade reading assessment tool that's now been adopted and used in over 40 countries. So it's an exciting time. And I think a meeting like this is also contributing to sort of the knowledge base and the communities of practice that are also growing. And one example of that, I think in mid-September, there's going to be a reading workshop that's going to be organized by the Global Partnership for Education. I think countries from around the Asia region are going to be invited to come with their country delegations, including governments, development partners, and non-governmental organizations that are working in the reading space to basically share lessons, to share perspectives, to share ideas, to learn from each other, as Ghana is already doing and has done for many years. So we're excited about that. We're also excited to be working since when our new strategy came out last year. We made a commitment to try to improve, at least on the donor side, more and better collaboration with our development partners. So we're working with DFID, USAID, the World Bank, Hewlett Foundation back in Washington on a joint research agenda around early grade reading so that we don't have 5 different agencies going to the same country, doing the same kinds of studies. We want to share information, best practices, and make sure we have a better coordinated approach. Am I out of time? Yeah, GPE. So the GPE, we actually had planned on having a representative from the GPE Global Best Practices Group in Washington join us for the meeting later, but it looks like that's probably not going to happen. But yesterday and today, they actually were meeting in Washington to with implementing partners and interested organizations, developing communities of practice around early grade reading to try to, again, share lessons, best practices. They're going to take that on the road. They're going to do one, I think, that's being sponsored by USAID in Sydney in a couple of months. So all that's to say, I think the work that you're doing here in India is in many ways at the forefront of a lot of this research. Certainly some of the assessment work that's being done in India has been pioneering. I think the other thing I'd like to just say before I close is India's special in so many ways. And when I mentioned to the GPE folks back in Washington, I said, well, we should invite India to the GPE Asia workshop. And the initial response was, well, India is not a GPE country in the same way India wasn't an EFA country. I said, yeah, but there's so much to learn from India, and there's so much that they can share with their countries around the region. Wouldn't it be great if we can have people who are doing really cutting-edge research and assessment and programming around early grade reading to share that information? And so we're hoping in the same way that Bill mentioned this morning that this is very much sort of a partnership approach, that we think that obviously early grade reading is important for India, but we think India has a lot to share with the region, if not the world. And so we're looking forward to sort of ongoing collaboration and participation with all of you. And I know that the work that you're doing is definitely contributing to and influencing the work that we're doing back at headquarters, and certainly in USAID, and I'm sure in a lot of other development agencies as well.